everybody, and welcome back to the Mindy Raquant podcast. I'm your host, Mindy Raquant, and today we're going to be continuing our marriage series, and we're going to be talking about conflict. So, conflict is something that we faced in our marriage, and it's different than what most people might think of as conflict. And conflict is not just bickering or yelling or arguing. It can be really complex, and so I hope to be able to approach this with a lot of grace, and so please just hear my heart in all of this. In the beginning of our marriage, we faced a lot of me shutting down because I felt unheard, and Mike would get frustrated, and I think he also felt unheard because neither of us were really communicating well. And so I never really thought that we faced much conflict, though, because we didn't yell at each other. It was a lot of silence, and so I just kind of assumed that we didn't have much conflict, but it was going on at a very deep level, and so it just took some time for us to work through those things. There were a lot of things that we would face conflict over. Some of those things were managing bedtimes. I will be talking about that later in the episode. Watching movies was something we faced in the beginning. Sex, as we've been talking about in the last couple of episodes, and even Mike's jokes. I remember that in the beginning of our marriage, Mike loves to make jokes. That's just part of his personality, and it's something he loves to do. And I would get really irritated, and I would not think that they were funny. I would just be like, oh, some stupid man jokes. Like, I literally thought that. And it took me some time and healing to actually be able to laugh at his jokes. And it was a contention point for us for a long time. Another thing is that Mike is an inventor. He's just somebody who loves to tinker, and he loves to create things, and he can literally make something out of almost nothing. It's just part of him. He's always been that way. One of his gifts or talents is to go into any environment and look around and observe what's going on and be able to assess where things could run more efficiently, make things work more smoothly. And he's just wired that way. And so when we first got married, I would be doing something, I don't know whether it was cooking or whether it was, I don't know, anything really. And he would give me suggestions or ideas for how I could do it more efficiently, how I could work better. And I would get really frustrated and shut down because I thought, I was so insecure that I thought he was telling me that I wasn't doing it good enough. And in reality, he was just giving me a suggestion. He was just giving me an idea. And of course, over time, as I've healed and gotten more secure, I'm now able to receive what he says. And if I'm doing something and I'm like, hey, babe, I don't really want any suggestions right now, I will just tell him that. And he is able to receive that. And we are now able to work together on that instead of it being this huge me getting mad and shutting down on him. We just learned how to communicate what we want or don't want, and it's not as big of a problem anymore. And back then we had so much silent conflict, and I would just shut down over almost anything. And because it was silent, I assumed that we didn't really have any conflict, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. Shutting down is just another form of fighting. It's just another form it's just another form of conflict. Shutting down is more difficult to work with because you don't know what the other person is thinking. And when I would shut down, I was stunting our marriage from growing. I was like putting this cap on where our marriage could go. And conflict is not bad. Conflict is actually a good thing because it's showing you where you can grow, and it's actually good because it's a healthy way of showing you where you need to grow. And conflict handled in a healthy way is actually the fastest way to grow your marriage. Let me say that again. conflict handled in a healthy way is actually the fastest way to grow your marriage. So we just need to learn how to handle conflict and the right way to view it. So the problem is that most people view conflict with a fixed mindset instead of the growth mindset. And I love talking about the fixed mindset and growth mindset. If you have purchased my book, you will hear me talk about that in the book, because it's just been something that's literally transformed my life. So I'm going to define for you what a fixed mindset is. So the fixed mindset is the belief that abilities are set in stone and unchangeable. And the growth mindset is the belief that a person's abilities can be improved through effort, learning, and persistence. So what does that have to do with conflict? So the fixed mindset looks at problems and hurdles, aka conflict, as something to be attacked rather than worked with. The growth mindset sees obstacles and challenges as a good thing because there's always a way through the hard things. It's a perspective shift, but it makes all the difference in the world. So having a fixed mindset will keep your marriage stuck in a cycle of conflict and victimization and fear, all the negative stuff that we don't want. And having a growth mindset takes you out of that cycle, and it forces you to look at things differently, to come up with creative solutions, and to actually love your spouse through the conflict. It says, this problem that we're facing is not bigger than how we handle it. We can always figure out a way to move through this. You're not a victim of conflict. You're not a victim of shutting down, of bad behavior. You're not a victim of bad cycles. You can learn to break free from them. The growth and fixed mindset topic is huge, and I cannot cover it in one episode. There's actually a book that I can link below if you would like to study more about that. It's called Mindset. Oh, you know what? I can't actually remember the title, but it's a very, very good book, and it goes into a very big amount of detail, so I will link that below. But there is one quality of the growth mindset that I'm going to talk about, and that is empathy. So empathy means the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, and it's not the same thing as sympathy. So sympathy is just acknowledging someone else's struggle, but empathy is choosing to feel that struggle with them. So I'm going to go through some steps that explain that in more detail. So the first step is to imagine yourself in a situation similar to the one the other person is struggling with, and what that would be like. And that is called cognitive empathy. And the second step is emotive empathy. So you identify with that struggle so that you can stand not face to face, so that you can stand side by side with the struggling person in their pain. It brings you together, and I think that's huge. I've actually heard that for men, what they perceive to be conflict is fighting, is being, head to head, face to face. They're in that combat mode. But when you want to get vulnerable with a man and you want to actually get close to his heart, you want to be sitting beside him, because that's gonna be showing him that you care and that you want to work through things together, and that you're not just like butting heads. I think I remember Mike telling me that in the beginning of our marriage, was that he doesn't want to be literally facing face to face with me. He wants to be sitting beside me, and that even just that physical position puts you in a really different mental space. And so that's something that you can actually literally do, is instead of standing there face to face yelling at each other or whatever, maybe shutting down, just sit next to each other and see how that makes you feel. It just brings you into a different space. So the third step is empathic. I think I'm saying that right. Empathic action. Don't do something to fix it. Just sit with them. And I think that's huge too, because A lot of people struggle with being silent in a conversation. A lot of people think they might need to fill the space and just come up with something to say and just spew off anything that comes to their minds. And in reality, that's really not a wise thing to do, especially when it comes to conflict. We need to choose our words very, very carefully, and we need to think before we speak. And when you are having conflict, our emotions tend to be running high, and we tend to just say anything that comes to our heads, and that is just not a good idea. We need to be careful and make sure that we are thinking before we speak and not letting our emotions lead our words. So that with that in mind, conflict is never a behavior problem. It's always a heart problem. It's never a behavior problem. It's always a heart problem. Conflict is often when we put up walls to protect ourselves from getting hurt, but conflict is actually when we need the most to be vulnerable. Conflict is when we need to have soft, open hearts. It gives us a chance to practice empathy. So the number one rule of conflict is that it's always about your heart, as we said. So I'm going to read some verses. Hold on, let me grab my Bible. I'm going to read Matthew chapter 7, verses 17 through 20. And I'm reading in the NLT version. So Matthew chapter 7, verses 17 through 20. A good tree produces good fruit, and a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. So every tree that does not produce good fruit is chopped down and thrown into the fire. Yes, just as you can identify a tree by its fruit, so you can identify people by their actions. So, handling conflict in a way that targets behavior is like trying to get a rotten tree to produce healthy apples. And if the apples are rotten, there's a deeper problem. So if your behavior is rotten, there's a deeper problem. We're not just trying to approach conflict from a surface level. We have to approach conflict from a deeper level. Otherwise, you will just continue repeating in the same cycles over and over again. So Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And that comes from Mark chapter 12, verses 30 through 31. I have heard it said before that an idol is anything that we want more than God. And anything that we desire more than God, it means that we're not loving Him with all of our hearts. So I'm going to go ahead and read James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires at war within you? You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure. So that sounds to me a lot like sin. What we want, which is what sin is the opposite of God's desires. What God wants is the opposite of sin. That's the core of sin. It's a worship problem. It's a heart problem. It's a desires problem. It is not an outward thing. So, conflict shows us where our desires are focused on. It reveals our hearts. If we are truly worshiping God in the core of who we are, then we're not going to be handling conflict in an unhealthy way. However, that being said, I do think that a lot of us desire to love God more, and yet we still handle conflict in an unhealthy way because we don't know what else to do. So handling conflict is a skill to be learned, and it takes time. And so that's what you're listening to this episode for. So that was the struggle that we faced of bedtimes, like I mentioned earlier in the beginning of this episode. So I needed to get up at 5 a.m. to go to work, and Mike did not have a set time to go into work, so he did not have to get up early. He didn't have to go to bed early. But I wanted to go to bed early because I had to get up so early, and so I would go to bed and I would curl up in a ball and I would cry because I just felt so alone, forsaken, and abandoned. And Mike would wonder what he had done to hurt me so badly. And so the real problem that we were facing was not that Mike needed to come to bed at exactly the same time as me. The real problem that we were facing was that there was a heart issue that I had not dealt with. And that if we were just trying to make Mike come to bed with me, that would be focusing on the surface, on the behavior, rather than on the heart of the situation. So what I needed to do was figure out why I was so angry and why I felt so sad about it. I needed to do some heart work. And so I had to face my pain. I had to own my responsibility. I had to find emotional healing. I had to take personal responsibility to figure out what was going on. And I had to forgive people from my past who had caused those wounds of abandonment and rejection. And I had to go to God to meet my needs. I had to let Him heal my heart, and I had to let Him fill me up. And that was where we could go from there to figure out a bedtime solution. So, I no longer have to wake up at 5 a.m., so it's a little bit different now, but over the years we have figured out that 10 to 10:30 is usually a pretty good bedtime for us. And sometimes I go to bed earlier, sometimes Mike even goes to bed earlier, which is honestly kind of shocking. He never used to do that, but life happens, and now that he has a job where he does need to get up early, sometimes we do go to bed earlier than that. It's just become kind of a teasing thing for us now. We sometimes joke about it and tease each other about who gets to go to bed earlier. So, yeah, I hope that's helpful for you. Just remember to approach it from a heart problem and not from a surface behavior level. So another example is that we faced a similar problem with movies. I did not grow up watching movies because I grew up Mennonite and we were not allowed to watch any movies at all. So after I left the Mennonites and got married, I learned how to watch movies. We liked to watch movies together, but I didn't like it. Mike liked to watch movies, but I did not. And so it just made me feel so much pain, and it was all those abandonment rejection wounds surfacing again. So the solution was not for us to never watch movies again. The root problem was my heart. I was in so much emotional pain that watching a movie made me feel like I was unloved. But I had to go through the same process of forgiveness and releasing people and going to God to meet my needs and letting God heal my heart. There was just a lot of heart work that I had to do, and it also did take quite a bit of time. It probably took me a couple of years to be able to watch a movie without getting triggered. But the second rule of conflict is that you have to watch your tongue. You cannot handle conflict without using your tongue. And this is something that was a little interesting for me because I had always been so shut down and I wouldn't talk. So I'm going to go ahead and read James chapter 3. And this is the passage that talks about the tongue. So James chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. Oh, hang on. I'm at the wrong spot. Here we go. James chapter 3, 7 through 12. People can tame all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and fish, but no one can tame the tongue. It is restless and evil, full of deadly poison. Sometimes it praises our Lord and Father, and sometimes it curses those who have been made in the image of God. And so blessing and cursing come pouring out of the same mouth. Surely, my brothers and sisters, this is not right. Does a spring of water bubble out with both fresh water and bitter water? Does a fig tree produce olives or a grapevine produce figs? No, and you can't draw fresh water from a salty spring. So I just think it's interesting that you have that same comparison there that Jesus was giving with the fruit from the tree, that a good tree can't produce bad fruit and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. So it's all about the heart. It's not about just trying to control your tongue. It's about watching your heart, because that's where your words come from. So I remember thinking that I was a very good person because I didn't talk. I didn't say all those nasty things. I didn't yell at my husband, but I was shutting down. And I didn't realize that that's actually a different form of communication. It still is a form of communication, and it's actually super, super deadly, and it's really dangerous. I was I was always a quiet person growing up, and people seem to call it a virtue in me. People seem to think that I was such a good girl because I just didn't say anything, but what they didn't realize was that my heart was full of so much junk and trash and brokenness inside. And once I started to open up, guess what came out? A whole lot of trash, okay? So that's the problem with shutting down and not speaking. Your tongue is the overflow of your heart, and it's where your heart is revealed. And it's still true for those who don't talk. I used to think that that rule didn't apply to me because I didn't talk, but here's the thing. If you shut down when conflict arises, that's a very good sign that you're afraid of conflict. You're afraid of getting hurt. And here's a good question. Are you afraid of being honest about what you're actually thinking because you don't want to be exposed? It's hard to be honest and really admit what we're thinking, because sometimes when there's conflict, we feel things that are really not pretty. And we don't want to be honest about that because we don't want to be seen as a bad person. But when it really comes down to it, we need to be honest about what we're actually thinking and feeling without going into a place of yelling at each other. It's really difficult, and we each need to be in a place of surrender about this. So, this sounds extremely harsh, but it's the truth. Being quiet does not mean that your heart is any better than anyone else's. Saying nothing does not automatically put your heart into the right place. Refusing to talk about hard things can be another form of bringing death instead of life. There is no way to work through conflict without talking, and it also stuffs rotten fruit into your heart, such as bitterness, anger, fear, pain, insecurity, jealousy. The list goes on and on. So, body language is also a huge aspect of communication. So even if your mouth isn't talking, your body is. Your eyes, your hands, your arms, your body position, your posture, it's all saying something. And the question is, what is it saying? So the solution to shutting down is to face your fear. And in the last episode, I talked about my healing process for going from hating sex to actually opening up and enjoying it. So it's exactly the same here. It's exactly the same thing of you have to be willing to get vulnerable. You have to be honest about the lies that you're believing. You have to kick them out, and you have to replace them with the truth. So I had to be willing to admit that I wasn't a good person just because I didn't yell at Mike. I had so much bitterness and fear and anger that was locked up inside, and I had a lot of forgiveness to do. So, I don't think that the answer is just to say, like I said earlier, we can't just say everything that comes to our minds. We have to use wisdom in what we speak. But I think the difference is that shutting down is actually just locking up your heart really tight and you can't let anything out, whereas self-control is using wisdom in how and when and where you speak. And so that's up to the Holy Spirit to lead you and to show you if you are shutting down or if you need to use self-control with your tongue. I think we all just need to allow the Holy Spirit to show us how to do better with that. So I have a couple of questions here, and I would encourage you to write these questions down and to go over them in your journal or whatever you do. So, whether or not your spouse is being humble and loving, you have a responsibility as a lover of God to be humble and loving, even if your spouse is not. So, you have to let God soften your heart. And so, here's the questions for you. Where have you been having a fixed mindset? How can you develop a growth mindset today, regardless of your spouse? Their growth and change does not depend on yours. How can you love God better? What areas have you been allowing yourself to idolize and desire other things or people more than God? How does your heart need to be changed? How can you practice empathy instead of putting up walls and hiding? How can you open up, soften your heart to receive God's love for you and in turn receive your spouse's love for you? How can you show love to your spouse in whatever type of conflict that you may be facing? So, I hope that this episode has been helpful for you. And like I already mentioned, I have my book here that has just been released. And thank you to all of those of you who have ordered it already. It means the world to me. And I'm so excited to hear what you guys have thought of it and how it has blessed you. And I go into a lot of detail in the book about all of these things that we've been talking about. So I hope that all of this has been helpful to you. I really do pray that these episodes have been helping marriages and have been blessing other people. And I just pray that marriages are changed and helped through these conversations. And yeah, have a blessed week.